This might be a long one. And so let me first off say I am not an expert on much. I'm not an expert on motorcycles. I'm not an expert on working on motorcycles, marketing motorcycles, even riding motorcycles. I freely admit that. And I'm going to be offering very little facts in this vlog. I'll just be offering my own opinions. If I were the head of Indian Motorcycle R&D, what I would be working on over the next couple of years. Just this past weekend, I attended the launch party of the Indian Chieftain Limited and the Indian Chieftain Elite. And they're pretty bikes, but look at social media, and I see comments from people who are basically saying it's the same motorcycle. When are they going to invent, release something new or introduce something new? And the critics have a fair point. I am going to freely admit that I like my Indian a lot. I like the other Indians a lot. I'm sold on the Indian Motorcycle brand. So I kind of defend the Indian motorcycles for being what they are. Even though, a Harley guy will say, well, it's not a Harley. And Victory guys are going to say, oh, well, Indian took Victory out, so I don't like them. And some people aren't going to like the Art Deco looks of the Indians, and it's, hey, to each their own. I like them. So, nothing wrong with anyone other's opinion. But I do have to say, it is a fair gripe that Indian needs to introduce a new motorcycle. Even though they can claim that they've introduced 3 new motorcycles in the last 2 months. But really, they've just been new trim levels, as the only way that I can argue it. When you get right down to it, since Polaris took over Indian and they got the rights to the Indian mark, they've really only introduced, at best, 3 motorcycles. They started with, in 2014, with their initial launch in the Spirit Lake era, with the Chief. And it had 2 trim levels. It had the Chief Classic, which was the solo 1-up cruiser, and the Chief Vintage, which was a 2-up cruiser for light touring with saddlebags and a windshield and an engine guard. Then they also introduced the Chieftain, which is something that had never existed before in Indian motorcycle manufacturing, in any of the incarnations of Indian, which was a touring motorcycle with hard saddlebags and a front fork-mounted fairing. So those were new. Then in 2015, Indian added the Scout, which was a totally different motorcycle from the Chief or the Chieftain. And totally different frame, totally different engine, liquid cooled instead of air cooled, didn't have the valenced fender on the front or the covered up fender on the back. Totally different motorcycle, and a great looking motorcycle in my opinion. That's why I have one. But that was up to 2015, and those are essentially the 3 motorcycles that Indian has released. They've got the Scout, then they've got the Chiefs, and then they've got, or the family of Chiefs, and then they've got the touring family, which is the Chieftain. In 2015, they also introduced the Roadmaster, which people are going to say there's a lot of difference between a Roadmaster and a Chieftain, but from a cursory glance, a Roadmaster just looks like a Chieftain with a trunk and some lowers and some upgraded equipment, and a different seat and all of that. But the Chief and the Chieftain have their own similarities with the same engine, same transmission, a lot of the same standard equipment. Every Indian except the Scout is standard with cruise control, ABS, and a 6-speed transmission. And the Scout has a 6-speed, but in 2016, Indian introduced the Scout 60, which is my little girl here, which is it's a Scout with one less gear, a little bit less displacement, and a little bit less on the equipment, and it's blacked out, and it's cheaper, and it's now the entry-level Indian, and that's what I have, is the entry-level Indian, the Scout 60. And then in 2016 released the Springfield, which is Indian's competitor to the Road King. Now, it can be argued that that's a new motorcycle. The Springfield is, it's not a Chief, it's not a Chieftain. Well, it's really a Roadmaster. It's got the same suspension, it just doesn't have the trunk or the fairing or the lowers. But it's the same engine and transmission and basic frame of the other touring bikes of the Chieftain and the Roadmaster. They also came out with the Chief Dark Horse, which is a Chief Classic that's all black, and is a little bit cheaper because it has a little bit less on the way of equipment. Then, toward the end of 2016, Indian released the Chieftain Dark Horse. Same thing, just one up, all black, no engine guard, no passenger seat, no passenger pegs, and it was $1,000 less. And that was the Indian lineup going into 2017. And then the biggest innovation that Indian launched in 2017 was the Ride Command system, which was the new nav up front. Big nav screen, upgraded stereo, a touch screen that works with your gloves that just acts just like a smartphone or a tablet. Is really nice and has really helped Indian's popularity out. Evidence that I have for that is how many used motorcycles Fort Worth Indian, my local dealership, has now, because of people trading in older Chieftains without the Ride Command, Roadmasters without the Ride Command, as well as all kinds of Harleys and Victories and BMWs that they've traded in for these. And then there's the three new ones. The Roadmaster Classic, that was a couple months ago, and that's a Roadmaster, except it just has a leather trunk and leather saddlebags and no lowers. Aside from that, it's the same bike. And then this past weekend, they introduced the Chieftain Limited, which is essentially a Chieftain. The only exception is the front wheel. The front wheel doesn't have the valenced fender. Instead of a 16-inch front wheel, it's a 19-inch front wheel, and it's a nicer cut alloy wheel. And they're very close in price. The Limited is only $500 more than the standard Chieftain. But then they came out with the Elite, which has a really upgraded stereo and a 200-watt stereo on a motorcycle, and a really phenomenal paint job. And the way that it was described at the intro part, at the launch party, the walkarounds, was the Chief Limited. Well, that's like the Street Glide Special. The Chieftain's like the Street Glide. Chieftain Limited, that's like the Street Glide Special. And the Chieftain Elite, well, that's like the CVO Street Glide, which really isn't a fair comparison, because the CVO Street Glide has a different engine than the rest of the Street Glides, in that it's got the 114 cubic inch engine in it. So there's the Indian lineup. It's still essentially three motorcycles: the Scout family, the Chief family, and the Chieftain family. So I had some ideas on what Indian can work on next. And whether they do or not depends on whether or not somebody from Polaris listens to my channel. And if anybody from Polaris does take one of these ideas and run with it, you can just give me one for free and I'll take it as I'm compensated. The first thing that Indian said, a lot of people say they should get into bikes other than cruisers and tourers. It'd be nice to have an American-made motorcycle that is something other than a cruiser or a touring bike, which Harley attempted for a while with the Buells. And according to an article I read on Revzilla that Lemmy wrote, Indian's president let slip that they might actually be going that way and branching out beyond just the cruiser and touring market. So I'm kind of thinking out loud and pulling stuff out of thin air, but I actually think that Indian could come out with a decent amount of brand new motorcycles with a little bit of R&D. The first thing that I expect is the Victory Impulse electric motorcycle to be rebranded. Polaris paid too much for that design, and they already have it, so they might change the bodywork a little bit and rebrand it as an Indian. What they'd call it, I don't know, a spark, lightning, firefly, who knows. It's got to be, something Native American-y. So there's that. But before Indian branches out into the bikes that are outside of the cruiser touring bike lineup, I kind of think they need to fill that out just a little bit more. And instead of just offering different trim levels of Chiefs and Chieftains, that they actually could come out with some stuff that's new to compete with some Harleys that they don't currently compete with at all. Indian does not have a motorcycle with a frame-mounted fairing, like a Harley-Davidson Road Glide or a Victory Vision. Polaris has already made a frame-mounted fairing bike with the Victory Vision. I don't think that they could take that look and put it on an Indian. I don't know that that'd work, but they need one. Keep the same Thunderstroke 111 engine and the transmission and keep all of that stuff there. You can even get by with the same frame, just change the fairing to a fork-mounted fairing, to a frame-mounted fairing and have the option, like Harley does with the Street Glides and Road Glides. You can either have a fork-mounted fairing with a Chieftain or a frame-mounted fairing with what I would call the Warrior. I don't know why. I just think I would. Indian's Chiefs kind of compete more with the Harley-Davidson Softails. So Indian, in my opinion, doesn't have anything to go against the Harley-Davidson Dyna family. And here's my proposal for that. We call it the Renegade. And you take something similar to a Scout, but you make it bigger in every aspect. A larger frame Scout, a Scout that's the size of a Chief, as opposed to the Scout that's smaller. You put in an engine that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 cubic inches. That's going to be around 1,300 cc's. Or you go 75, so you can get closer to 1,200 cc's. You go with liquid cooled, and they already have the 1,200 cc engine that they put in the Victory Octane. Have it liquid cooled. You have the rear shocks on the outside, so you've got, the hardtail like the Dyna. I don't even know if that's a hardtail. Like I said, I'm not an expert. But, the shocks are mounted on the outside for the rear. And you can have different trim levels of that where you've got the light touring version and everything. But, the main thing that bike needs to fill is that huge price gap between the Scout with the 69 cubic inch engine that's around 11,500-ish and the Chieftain Dark Horse, which is 17,000. You need the $14,000 bike to compete against the bikes like the Street Bob and some of those other Dynas. And Indian doesn't have that. And so that's what you do. You make a bigger Scout. You call it a Renegade. And it doesn't even have to have the same 111 engine in it. It can be, like I said, 80 cubic inch, 75 cubic inch, something like that. And then that fills that in. And then the other bike, hi Harley. Then the other bike that I would put in to the cruiser lineup, I would call the Scout 45, and I really don't know why they don't have this yet. Indians already has had a bike, a very well-respected and well-loved motorcycle from their history called the Scout 45, which for those of you who don't want to do the metric conversions, a Scout 45, a 45 cubic inch engine, would basically be a 750cc. The reason I'm saying that they need that is for a lot of people, Indian does not have an entry-level motorcycle. I'm on the entry-level motorcycle. It's not large. It's, to me, not heavy, but I'm 6'2", and I'm 260, 270 pounds. There are people who are smaller than me. My wife, for instance, who's like 5'3" and about 110 pounds. And to her, for a first motorcycle, a $9,000 bike that's 999 cc's of engine displacement and is 562 pounds wet with just the stock equipment on it is a little intimidating. The weight can be intimidating, even though, yes, for an experienced rider, the size and weight of the motorcycle make no difference. It's what the the operator can control. But for a beginner, 560 pounds is intimidating. A $9,000 bike is a lot to drop, and 1,000 cc's is a lot of power. And this thing's got 72 horsepower on the dyno, and that's a lot of power. Those training bikes that are used in MSF classes, they've got like 12 horsepower. And they weigh around 300 pounds. So this thing, to someone who's getting off of an Electra Glide or a Chieftain, they're going to say that the Scout is tiny and is as light as a feather. But for somebody who's getting off of a Kawasaki Eliminator in their Motorcycle Safety Foundation beginner rider course, it weighs a freaking ton and has enough power to be a little scary. Now you can grow into it, and the Scout is really easy to control, but they don't have that, what I would say, the true entry-level bike somewhere in the neighborhood of a 750. And so that's where the Scout 45 would come in. And you go with the Scout, but you have a smaller frame. And Indian already has the engine. They have the FTR 750 that's racing an AMA dirt track right now. So you retool something so that you can mass produce that 750, and that is an important engine to mass produce for my hypotheticals here. So there's your Scout 45. You can and now you've got a Scout that can compete head-to-head with the Harley-Davidson Streets, the 500s and the 750s, because it would also be closer to them in price. It wouldn't be a $2,000 step up, because the Scouts as they exist now don't compete with the Streets. They compete more with the Harley Sportsters. The Scout 60 with the Sportster 883 line, and the standard Scout with the 1200 Harleys. So, I mean, you could even have the thicker board cylinders on that FTR 750 engine and make it a 500cc, and then you've got a true beginner bike. Now, people that buy them, trade them in. I mean, yeah, a beginner should start on a used motorcycle, something they're not going to worry about dropping or anything like that. Or you just start with the bike you want. A lot of people's financial situations don't allow them to just go out and buy a $2,000 bike. Where I live, a 250cc bike with any kind of, hey, look, it runs kind of condition, it's going to be about $2,000. Cash, private party. If you don't have that kind of thing lying around, then you got to look at what you can get from a dealer. Or you just got to wait and you don't ride a motorcycle. Okay, so there's the Scout 45 with the 750cc engine. Now, everything else you build off of that engine. Let's take that 750. Let's raise the frame up a little bit. Move the pegs from forward mount to mid mount. And now you can start branching out of the cruiser touring bike range. And you turn that Scout 45 into a cafe racer. And you name it after a very famous Indian racer, Burt Munro, from the New Zealander who set the land speed record for an under 1,000cc bike in the late 1960s. It still stands to this day, and he did it on a 1920 Scout 45. So it's a Scout 45, just like his. You make it liquid cooled, though, because it's modern. And now it's raised up and it's a cafe racer. Maybe put a little, headlight fairing on the front, but no other bodywork other than the standard gas tank and fenders. You make that a cafe racer and you call that the Munro, M-U-N-R-O. Then, with that same 750 engine in it, you take that same engine, you take that same bike, and you do with it like the metrics, like Honda and Kawasaki do, and you skin it with sport bike fairings. And now you've got a sport bike, and you call that the Munro Special. And you kind of, you pattern the fairings a little bit like the Munro Special that it used to set it. It's very bullet-shaped, a single round headlight in the front. You still maintain Indian's design integrity, and you give the people an Indian sport bike, a true faired sport bike. And anybody who wants to say that there's no such thing as a V, why would you want a V-twin on a sport bike? Tell that to Ducati. They do rather well with their V-twin sport bikes. You don't want a V-twin cafe racer? Tell that to Moto Guzzi. They do really good with theirs as well. All right. Then and once you've got those lines introduced, Well, if you've got the smaller bore 500cc, you could put those in the Cafe Racer and the sport bike as well. You can also move up to the other Scout engines, the 61 cubic inch that's in this one, the 69 cubic inch that's in the standard Scout, and then you've got your leader sport bikes. So there's that whole family, but you gotta have that 750. You also take that 750, you really bump up the suspension, and you turn it into an adventure bike based off of that same 750 power plant. And you call that the Spirit, the Indian Spirit, and it's an adventure bike. I have no idea how they would do the design on that. The Monroe Cafe Racer, you can find, the Cafe Racer's already retro. And then you go with the kind of retro styling on a sport bike. BMW is doing that a little bit now. I have no idea how you would make a retro-looking adventure bike. How do you do an Art Deco bike with a beak? I don't know, but Indian has good designers. They'll figure it out. But there's where you get that, and it all comes from mass producing that 750cc racing engine that currently hasn't lost a race in AMA dirt track this season. They've finished first and second twice and swept the podium once. And there's only been 3 races this season in AMA twin racing. And speaking of AMA, there's a single-cylinder class in AMA. I'm sure it's the success that Indian's having in the twin series that they're going to develop a single-cylinder to go into the single-cylinder class. Well, there's a true starter, because then you're going to have your 300, 400cc bike. You know, single-cylinder thumper. Call it a Scout 30 or whatever, and you can just introduce that across the family. You'll have the true entry-level cruiser, the true entry-level sport bike to compete with your Ninja 300 and Honda CBR 300R, and you throw it on it, and then you take it and you just put it on an enduro bike, and then you've got a supermoto that'll go. It won't be like the 750 adventure bike. You want a bigger adventure bike? Compete with the BMW 1200? Well, you've already got the 1200 engine. You've got an 1132cc engine with the Scout. You use that engine, you just put it into a different frame. All of this, you've really just got to mass produce an engine that you're producing for racing and come up with a new engine to go on to that mid-range Indian. Or you use the Thunderstroke 111 on that Dynaframe-like Indian, just so that you have something in that price point, because there's a huge gap in price point between the Scout and the Chief Dark Horse. And then no Indian R&D would be complete without bringing up the one Indian that I hear all of the other Indian IMRG writers saying that's what they want to see, is to bring back the Indian 4. Now, there have been a lot of newspaper articles, and as an owner of a Scout, I can confirm that the back cylinder on this bike, even with the water cooling, the back cylinder on this bike gets warm, especially in the summertime. And that's true with most V-twins. And if Polaris is having trouble keeping the back cylinder cool, or at least from getting hot, on a V-twin, how are they going to do that with the back 3 cylinders on an inline 4? So they probably have to liquid cool it. You go with an inline 4 on an Indian, that's going to have to be a muscle bike. Well, there's your head-to-head competitor with the Harley V-Rod. So you make the Indian 4, you come out with that 4-cylinder engine, you put it in a bike similar to a Harley V-Rod but with Indian styling, and now you're going after that one. That would be a rather healthy Indian lineup, don't you think? Because it gives you your muscle bike, it gives you that mid-range cruiser, it gives you the frame-mounted fared touring bike, it gives you something more akin to a true entry-level bike for somebody who doesn't want to start off on a 500-pound plus motorcycle with 1,000 cc's. Yeah, you can argue that there are people who can, and I'm going to argue with you that there are people that that's just not practical for. But I don't want them to be scared away from the sport of motorcycling, or to be able to get the feeling of being out on a bike. while I will agree that somebody could start with a Scout 60 as their first motorcycle, I don't think it's a good idea. And that's just my personal opinion. But I'll admit, a lot of it depends on that specific rider. But you got to have that entry-level bike. You bring in that true entry-level bike, you hook them while they're young. You know, that kind of stuff. And then you get the things that people are clamoring about, hey, you get the American-made Cafe Racer, or you get the American-made Standard, you get the American-made Sport Bike, you get the American-made Adventure Bike and Dirt Bike, and that's what all the folks on social media mention and complain about when Indian introduces another trim level of a Chieftain or a Roadmaster. Now but then the real question is, will those people who say, why won't we get an American sport bike, will they actually buy it if Indian makes it? I don't know. That's a totally different question. But there's my theory on how you come up with these new bikes. So if you see at some point in the next 5 years an Indian Renegade or an Indian Monroe or a Monroe Special or a Scout 45 or a Spirit or a Warrior out on the road, and they actually match the descriptions that I just gave you right here on April 12th, 2017, you'll know that I thought of it first. Whether they do it or not, I don't know. But there you go, going off to Indian Demo Days this weekend. I've got a request from one of my viewers to take out a Chief Dark Horse, so I'll definitely have a moto vlog on a Chief Dark Horse. I had to throw away my vlogs on most of the other Indians at the last Demo Days, so I'm going to try to get those caught up, see if I can go out on one of the new Chieftain Limiteds. I definitely need to get a vlog up of a Springfield.